Thank you very much for that introduction. And thanks to Professor Francis Sheely and the TMRN and its funder, the HRB, for the invitation to speak. So today, I'm going to be talking about something we've heard lots about. The phrase pragmatic trial is often bandied about, but there's relatively little discussion of what that means and where that concept comes from. So that's what I'm going to try and focus on today, is the concepts that underlie the notion of pragmatic and explanatory trials. So we're going to try and understand the different origins of internal and external validity in evaluation studies, because that's the foundation for understanding applicability, which is the main characteristic that we hope to imbue our trials with when we're trying for a pragmatic trial. We're then going to recognize two alternative ways of doing randomized trials, that is, two purposes or two intentions which might underlie our randomized trial, and only one of those will describe the trial that we each are doing each time. So we choose either to do a pragmatic trial, which is a trial that's intended to provide evidence for decision makers to choose between interventions, or we could alternatively choose to do a trial which has an explanatory intention, which is to test a hypothesis about a mechanism of action of an intervention. So these two intentions, pragmatic and explanatory, are the two concepts that I'm going to try and explain the foundations of. And then the second half of the talk is to understand how we match the actual design choices we make when designing a trial with the intention that we set for that trial at the beginning. So when I talk about trial, and this is not true for everyone, but when I talk about a trial, I'm referring to a randomized trial with a control group. And the reason why I always am talking about a randomized trial is because randomization is absolutely central to the validity, particularly the internal validity of randomized trials. And the reason for it is because randomization, uniquely, only randomization equalizes the distribution between trial arms of known and unknown confounders and non-specific causes, leaving only the treatment effect visible as the inference you draw from your trial. So randomization guarantees the internal validity of that estimate. In other words, when we produce a randomized trial inference, it's true for the participants in the trial and in that trial setting at that time, and the individuals that they represent in a metaphorical statistical sense. But this internal validity, while it's absolutely crucial for a meaningful randomized trial, doesn't in and of itself have anything to do with external validity of that trial. So the applicability of the trial is completely independent from its internal validity. External validity and internal validity, as we'll see in a second, are pretty much independent aspects and independently set. But both of them are needed for pragmatic uses. So if we're designing a trial whose purpose is to help decision makers make a choice between alternative interventions, we need that trial to be both internally valid and applicable, or to have very high degree of external validity. The design of a trial for internal validity is something we do almost by convention. We know how to design a trial to avoid bias, but we seldom think carefully about the sources of external validity or how to do designs that help with that. Now, the trialist, the trial designer, is the person who makes the choices around external validity and applicability. But to what or to whom does the trial designer create this applicable? To what or to whom, rather, are the inferences of this trial applicable? Well, usually the trial designer has in mind a particular setting and a particular patient group, and this is usually and most successfully a real group. So we're talking about specific kinds of patients, often that the trial designer has seen or looked after or helped someone else to look after in a particular setting and at a particular health system and time in history. It's not the trial designer who decides how broad the findings of their how broadly the findings of their trial will apply. That's for the decision makers in each setting who decide whether or not to make use of those findings. That external applicability at the second hop, as it were. The first hop is from who we include in our trial to who we believe that trial that we designed is applicable to. But the second hop is those who read our trial report decide whether or not that trial that we've conducted is relevant to their setting, their participants, and their time and their health system. So there's a two-stage process for external validity or applicability. And it's not the trialists who make the second assessment. And just thinking about it as a cartoon, on the left we see the more traditional approach, where you have a homogeneous group of patients, often relatively small, a large resource of trial personnel who use unusual tests to evaluate the progress of that patient in response to the intervention or the control. On the right-hand side, we have the more applicable approach, the more pragmatic approach, if you like, and there we would have a more heterogeneous set of participants or patients, a much smaller group of providers, very few, if any, and very unobtrusive trial personnel to help run the trial, and diagnostic and therapy and co-interventions which are typical of the usual flow of care. So unaltered usual care is the normal approach in a pragmatic trial. But the way in which we've traditionally designed randomized trials departs dramatically from that more applicable approach. So traditionally, the trials we do choose peculiar patients, peculiar providers, and an unusual site. So often the patients might be more severe, but not maximally severe. So there's lots of responsiveness to the potentially possible for the intervention. They may, for example, have few or no comorbidities in most traditional trials. That patient participants might be from a narrow age range, and there may be lead-ins to find out whether or not to select good highly adherent patients. The trial sites themselves may be atypical in the sense that an intervention which, if it is proven successful, will be used in primary care by family practitioners might well be tested in an ambulatory care setting where specialist physicians are the main providers of care. So the trial sites may have more experience with that particular type of disease, a more severe end, and they may have better outcomes or better experiences in it. And the evidence for this comes from a review which showed that about 70% of randomized trials have selected participants in the trial which differ in important ways from the patients and the setting in which that treatment would be used once it's approved for usual care. More than 2/3 of trials are selecting participants and settings which are not directly applicable to the setting in which that intervention will later be used. That's a big gap between the evidence we use and the setting in which we wish to use the decision drawn from that evidence. So secondly, there are often in the traditional approach distortions in the way in which care is delivered, with extra investigations, extra interventions, co-interventions, standardized protocols for treatment, monitoring, reminders, enforcement of adherence, and intensive and intrusive data collection, all of which can change the relative effect size and absolute effect for that matter. Traditional trials frequently use obscure outcomes, obscure in the sense that they might be short-term rather than the long-term outcome that patients are most interested in and decision makers in the policy arena, as well as non-patient-centered outcomes, much more physiological, requiring a real jump between the physiological outcome and the assumption that that will improve well-being or life. The traditional comparators chosen are frequently an old drug or a relatively low dose of a commonly used drug, standardized doses and standardized drugs, or a comparison with placebo, which, as all of us know, is not a common feature in usual care. And finally, the analysis we use, even though we've been moving away from the per protocol analyses that in the 80s were shown to be misleading, we've replaced those with so-called modified intention to treat analyses, which are hard for me to distinguish from the previous discredited approach. Whereas what we're interested in the real world is for all of the people who were randomized to the offer of this treatment, how well did they do? All of them, on average, and ideally with important subgroups. And this can be lost in the common modern analyses in traditional trials. So we end up seeing that the way in which the traditional approach to randomized trial design favors internal validity, but devotes very little attention to external validity. And this has created the impression that there's a trade-off between internal validity and external validity, that you can't have good internal validity and good external validity. But I think I think of it rather differently. I think that internal validity is almost entirely dependent on randomization and allocation concealment, whereas the external validity is dependent on a number of choices around similarity of the participants and the setting to the future usual care setting in which this intervention will be used, and is therefore independent of the features which determine internal validity. So in fact, there's no trade-off, in my mind, between internal and external validity. And you can, in fact, have an internally valid trial, a highly valid, internally valid trial with high levels of applicability as well. But there is the widely prevailing assumption that that is not true. I'm going to skip that. Now, this concept was solidified in the 1960s by two French statisticians, Daniel Schwartz and Joseph Lelouch, who defined two types of randomized trials, pragmatic and explanatory, each of them with a completely different purpose. What they said in the start to their paper was that we think most trials are inadequately formulated. The inadequacy is profound in the sense that they may be aimed at the solution of either of two completely different kinds of problem, and yet don't take into account the possibility that they may not have specified which problem they're aiming at. So in a word, what Schwartz and Lelouch were saying is, you need to decide what your trial is going to be for. Is it for usual care decision-making, or is it for hypothesis confirmation, thinking more physiologically or mechanistically? And they end the same paper by saying, most trials have adopted what they call the explanatory approach and done so without question. I've been calling it the traditional approach, whereas the pragmatic approach would often have been much more justifiable. And so with that in mind, a group of us in 2009 developed a tool to help trial designers design trials which matched their intention. And this is whether the intention is pragmatic or explanatory. The idea behind this tool is that it helps the trial designer match, firstly specify their own intention, what do they want that trial to do, and then match all of the design choices one by one to that intention. In 2015, a group of us updated this tool, and you see it up here. And now, in 2025, a group of us, led by Professor Sheely over there, are updating it again to PRECIS 3, the most recent version. But what I'm going to describe is PRECIS 2. So just to repeat, the pragmatic attitude is that your intention is to help decision makers choose between interventions, and you're designing your trial so that the evidence directly supports that purpose. The explanatory attitude, different. The intention there is to test a hypothesis, a specific causal mechanism, and to see whether it's activated by the intervention that's being tested in the trial. And the differences in the trial design lie in PRECIS 2, 9 domains, and we're adding a few. We're adding one, in fact. The first is eligibility. These are the processes one uses to design a trial. Who will be eligible for the trial? And so in PRECIS 2, we say you need to decide to what extent the participants in your trial will be like those who would receive this intervention if it was part of usual care. So that's the, if you like, the criterion question for ensuring that your trial is either more pragmatic, or if you want your trial to be more explanatory, it would be at the opposite end of that spectrum, so to speak, and would be designed in a different way, not to match usual care patients in the usual care setting, but to maximize the responsiveness of the patients to the intervention that you're proposing. So a little bit like the traditional trials that we were talking about a minute ago. Recruitment would differ as well. For the pragmatic approach, you would be trying to match the way in which those same patients would be recruited to care under usual care circumstances in the future when that intervention was in place. For the setting, the third of the PRECIS 2 domains, you would be trying again to match the usual care setting. Organization refers to those extra staff and other resources that the trial may contribute to the setting during the trial only, but that render its findings less applicable to the future when those resources are removed. So that would be another domain. And then we would have flexibility of delivery, which is the degree to which the clinicians are free to do what they would normally do in usual care. Adherence, the freedom that patients have to adhere or not adhere to their medications as they would do in future usual care, with whatever supports are available in future usual care for that adherence. And follow-up would be the degree to which the intervention the evaluation, the measurements are intrusive or obtrusive and may distort the way in which patients or providers behave. And the eighth and ninth elements in the PRECIS 2 tool relate to the choice of the primary outcome and the degree to which it's important to the participants, patients usually, or to the decision makers if the trial is not specifically a drug trial. And then finally, the primary analysis, which again we talked about as being the peculiar and the irrelevant analysis, the analysis which distorts the randomization by selecting in a non-randomized fashion from those patients, some who have not missed outcomes, not had perfect adherence, and uses only those in the analysis. So avoidance of those irrelevant analyses is important for making your trial more pragmatic. And one new domain to be added is related to the comparator, which we've realized in commentary from many people on our PRECIS 2 tool, that there's a need to describe what you're comparing your novel intervention with. It might be another active comparator. It might be placebo with blinding, which would be a much more explanatory choice. Or it might be something with the freedoms of usual care. So these 9, and for PRECIS 3, 10 domains are the ways in which you match your design choice to the intention that you have for the trial. But the term pragmatic has been widely used, and it's been used quite loosely, we would say, without this underlying analysis of how randomized trials work. So many people use the term pragmatic rhetorically without a reference to any paper and without a reference to Schwartz and Lelouch. Sometimes they mean that they've been more inclusive of patients than is usual in traditional trials. Sometimes they mean that the setting is usual, but it's an undefined use of the term pragmatic. And this has been explicitly the case for NIH and PCORI, who haven't really defined what they mean by pragmatic trials in their funding documents. Something which I think is a useful thing to do, is to define exactly what you mean by pragmatic. Now in the United States, the term pragmatic is being used to describe trials that draw their measurements from administrative or electronic medical record data. Sometimes it's used to describe trials where there's an active comparator, that's in the comparative effectiveness research paradigm, and sometimes it's used to refer to patient engagement in the design of trials. So the term's currently quite loosely used in many places, and we'd strongly propose that a much more methodology-based, a much more conceptual and methodologically based understanding is applied. So in summary, what our group has done for the pragmatic and the explanatory concept that was first introduced by Schwartz and Lelouch is to to suggest that one starts in the trial by defining your intention explicitly and then trying to match the design choices you make to that intervention. So the two choices are either a pragmatic intention, which intervention should be preferred, or an explanatory intervention. Does this mechanism exist in humans, in a kind of experiment, laboratory-style experiment in human beings? So pragmatic and explanatory trials are another complete dichotomy. We'd argue that there's no trade-off between internal and external validity, and we'd say that pragmatic characteristics of the kind that I've described, the 9 domains, now 10, make the trials more useful for decision-making by patients, clinicians, and policymakers. Thanks very much.